Bonsoir. Merci. Alors, bonsoir à tous et à toutes. Je suis Stéphane Laroche, le directeur général du Musée d'art contemporain de Montréal, communément et affectueusement appelé le MAC. Alors, je suis heureux de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette conversation très attendue. Votre présence le démontre, entre Glenn Lowry et Homi K Bhabha, au nom du Musée d'art contemporain, l'un des 4 musées d'État québécois, le seul situé à Montréal. Cet événement s'inscrit dans une série de réflexions menées par l'équipe du MAC en préparation de l'ouverture du nouveau MAC à la Place des Arts, après son importante transformation actuellement en cours. L'échange exceptionnel de ce soir poursuit le cycle de grandes conférences inspirantes sur le commissariat d'exposition amorcé au printemps 2025. Le MAC a déjà reçu dans ce cadre Megan Lee, Candice Hopkins, Ngone Fall et Isabelle Bertolotti. Nous sommes ravis et fiers d'accueillir cette fois messieurs Glenn Lowry et Homi K Bhabha parmi nous. Je les remercie chaleureusement d'avoir accepté notre invitation. Et un grand merci aussi à Liliane Maurer, fondatrice de Art Speaks et grande amie du MAC, pour cette nouvelle collaboration entre le MAC et la formidable initiative artistique publique qu'est le Forum Art Speak. Sans plus tarder, je lui laisse la parole pour qu'elle nous en dise plus sur nos conférenciers et la thématique qu'ils comptent aborder ce soir. Alors, bonne conférence à tous et à toutes. Liliane?
Merci, Stéphane. It has been a complete pleasure working with the MAC to make this evening happen. For the last 10 years, Art Speaks has proudly hosted artists, curators, and thinkers who have challenged and stimulated us, inspired us, and provoked new thought. Tonight, with the MAC, we welcome 2 extraordinary thinkers who have shaped, each in their own way, how we understand culture. When François and Mojan asked if we would like to collaborate in one of a series of their Grand Conférence in anticipation of their opening in 2028, it took me exactly 1 second to say yes. Paul, Leslie, and I worked seamlessly with François and Mojan as we realized tonight's event. This conversation between Glenn Lowry and Homi K Bhabha will be recorded and followed by a question period. Microphones will be in the aisles for you to pose your questions to our speakers. And of course, please don't forget to put your phones on silent. Glenn Lowry, who just stepped down as director of MoMA after 30 years, is the embodiment of someone who has transformed a museum. Besides physically enlarging MoMA twice, he has also created a new model for the presentation of art. Under Glenn's direction, one of his many achievements at MoMA was the creation of a global research forum called CMAP, Contemporary and Modern Perspectives, which allied the museum with scholars around the world, which in turn transformed MoMA's collections and publications into a worldwide project which participates in the urgent work of rewriting the canon. During COVID, I went to New York and I was in MoMA's newly installed galleries pretty much alone, which is unusual, and was struck hard by seeing Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon juxtaposed beside Faith Ringgold's Die. It was unexpected and perfect. Thank you, Glenn, for hanging art across disciplines and across cultures, as MoMA does so well. It's liberating and refreshing and really quite thrilling. Glenn is no stranger to Canada. His wife, Susan, is from Montreal, and Glenn was director at the AGO in Toronto for 6 years prior to going to MoMA. So it's our great pleasure to have him back in Canada tonight. As an Islamic scholar, Glenn will now become advisor to the Islamic Arts Biennale in Saudi Arabia and also advisor to the Kiran Nadar Museum in New Delhi, along with his good friend Homi K Bhabha. Homi K Bhabha is a professor in the English and Comparative Literature Department at Harvard. Born in Bombay shortly after the 1947 partition, Homi K Bhabha's intellectual framework was deeply shaped by the fragmented realities of a post-colonial world. This historical backdrop led him to theorize the complex, fluid, and continuous negotiation of cultural identity. His work is influenced by his expansive curiosity and respect for other peoples and traditions. He is a prolific writer and is one of the most important cultural theorists of our time. His many books have brought concepts like multiculturalism and post-colonialism into the collective consciousness, concepts which are especially important in our globalized world. Homi has also written on contemporary art, bringing his broad-mindedness to the images and objects that help us think about our world. He's written for publications like Art Forum and on the work of artists like William Kentridge, Terence Simon, Anish Kapoor, and Matthew Barney, amongst others. Homi is a fellow at the British Academy of and the Royal Society of Literature. He sits on the board of the Kiran Nadar Museum in Delhi, New Delhi. He is also critic and resident at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and has held advisory positions with MoMA, the Rolex Foundation, and UNESCO. We are really excited to have you both with us tonight. Please welcome Homi and Glenn.
Merci, chère Liliane et cher Stéphane, pour cette chaleureuse introduction. Homi et moi sommes très reconnaissants du fait qu'on est peut-être la seule chose entre vous et un petit match d'hockey ce soir. Donc, nous essaierons d'être à l'heure. Et nous allons parler en anglais, si vous me permettez. So, when Liliane and François Majan invited me to do a lecture, I immediately thought that it would be far more interesting actually to do a conversation with somebody that I admire enormously and with whom I've been in conversation for well over a decade. Almost every week, Homi and I talk. And what do we talk about? We talk about cooking. Homi is a brilliant chef. We talk about restaurants we enjoy. We talk about objects we'd like to buy. I think we encourage each other to spend far more than either of our spouses ever thought was possible. We talk about clothing. You can see that I follow Homi in fashion. And we talk about art. We talk about art and museums and the way in which culture is shaped and formed. And that's what we're going to focus on tonight. The idea behind this conversation is that we'll talk for approximately an hour and then we'll open it up to all of you for questions. And our point of focus is going to be the way in which museums shape cultural conversations in times of crisis. And I think we can all agree that this is a moment of crisis in the world. So what's the role of the museum? How do works of art participate in helping us understand complex moments? And how do you imagine and reimagine a museum? Because we are extremely aware of the fact that the Museum of Contemporary Art is in the middle of a major transformation, and that offers an opportunity to think about the relationship between the local, the global, and the many different kinds of conversations that exist. So Homi, please know how grateful I am that you're willing to join me in a conversation with all of our friends here. And I thought I would start off with a slide that means a lot to me. Years ago, we did a project at the Museum of Modern Art where we invited anyone who came to complete one of these little cards. I went to MoMA and there were literally 10,000 cards that were produced over several months. And some people, and you can tell, thought hard about the way in which the intellectual environment of the museum caused them to grow, or how the museum is in a way a black box that you go into, that you look around, and if the museum does its job well, you can feel like you open up, like it has given you a new world. But the card that I keep on my desk to this day was written by young Annabelle, 9 at the time. I went to MoMA and saw a coat closet, trash, and 2 water fountains. I'm very disappointed I did not see a dinosaur. You call yourself a museum. And the reason I love this little card is not only that it reminds us that for all the seriousness of our work, there has to be joy and humor to it as well. but that actually young people see the world differently than us. Young Annabelle had no problem imagining a dinosaur at the Museum of Modern Art, something that for me would seem antithetical. And just to complete this loop, Homi and I are involved, as Lilian mentioned, with the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art, which is really a museum of modern and contemporary art in Delhi. In one of the principal exhibits, there will be a dinosaur. So the world has a way of completing itself. Let's turn to the first image, which is more serious. And Homi, maybe you and I can speak a little bit about the different ways in which museums construct themselves. And I'm very conscious of the fact that at the end of the day, a museum is first and foremost an idea. It's, of course, a building and objects, but underneath the building and underneath the objects are ideas. And this is a very well-known diagram that Alfred Barr, the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art, created. And the metaphor he developed for the museum was that it was like a torpedo moving through time, that the nose was the ever-advancing present and the tail was the ever-receding past. And that for a museum of modern art, it needed to locate itself in the present. So as the nose moved forward, the whole institution had to move forward. And you see here, he adjusts the time frame so that you go from essentially the nose being the School of Paris to the nose being the United States. And Homi, what do you think about this idea of the museum as a torpedo?
Well, Ken, you just give me a second. I want to thank you all for coming here.
Microphone.
Sorry. Give me a second, just to do the formalities. I want to thank Mac and ArtSpeak for inviting me. I want to thank you, Glenn, for making our private conversations more public by the day. I want to thank Lilian Mauer. I want to thank Stefan, Paul, Marjan, and Francois for their generosity in having me. Of course, it's a huge pleasure to be in conversation with my dearest friend, Glenn, but it's a pleasure I have lying in bed on Sunday afternoons, and he's doing the same, and we rap. So thank you, Glenn, for dressing up on this occasion. So I want to also apologize for not speaking in French. This would be an embarrassment to everybody. I was, of course, brought up at a time by the British in a post-colonial world, so I can speak English, which is what I'll do. But I also spent some time in England, where I learned franglais, and that would be a dire disaster if I spoke French in the English tradition. So here we are. To go back to your question, then I remember studying this diagram. And I think it's a very brave idea. It's a very brave idea, particularly the idea that then you would deaccessionize some of these works, that you had passed beyond and hand them over to other museums. I thought it was a very brave, very collaborative idea. The problem, of course, is that modernity and the modern, and they're not the same thing, are very particular measures of time. Because what you learn from them, what I learn even from MoMA, and even the re-kitting of MoMA, the retooling of MoMA, and in my own work, is a line from my new book, which I will vainly quote, which is that actually the past never dies, and the future doesn't wait to be born. And in the present, we have to deal with that. The past is like a torpedo that gets reinvented. It's not retrospective, it's retroactive. The future, by which we judge ourselves, what will this look like 10 years hence, is precisely that it is not going to wait. The judgment of the future is upon us. And we struggle then in the present to actually do something which confronts these orders of time and doesn't let us believe that there is a slow flow. And that's what I think, to go from this diagram to what I know of the new shaping of the Museum of Modern Art, that's what I think you have done with these juxtapositions. Lillian just talked about a particular juxtaposition in the Museum, the Picasso with Faith Ringgold. And that's what is so important there, is that it's by putting the audience in the interstices, in between those two things, that the museum does its work for you. And we do our work for museums to construct them and reconstruct them.
So I think you'll see over the course of the next hour that the issue is always going to be one of the intersection of space and time. That the museum creates a space, but there's also a temporal dimension to being in the museum. And I always admired Barr's desire when he created the Museum of Modern Art to try and create a museum that was different in kind from previous museums. That is, a museum that would live only in the present, that anticipated the future and recognized that it needed to do something with its past in order to remain in the present. And Homi talked about deaccessioning, because the original idea behind the museum was that, in fact, roughly every 50 years, the museum would deaccession its great works of art, or trade them to the Metropolitan or something else, in order to both make physical space and intellectual space for new works of art. And that worked for about a decade until somebody said, so we're going to give the Met Starry Night by Van Gogh? Really? And it foundered on the inability of the institution to actually live up to the promise and the premise that Barr developed. But more interestingly for our purposes, when you imagine the museum as a torpedo moving through time, how do you design the building to live this experience? And the way that was done was to create a series of galleries that were along a very narrow footprint, long, narrow footprint, and you entered in one gallery and then literally moved en filade through all of the other galleries till you left. And you started with Cézanne's Bather, one of the first paintings to enter the museum's collection. And from post-impressionism, you progressed to Cubism and the Demoiselle d'Avignon, and from Cubism to Futurism, and from Futurism to Orpheism, to Expressionism, all the way until you arrived at the present. And that creates a certain kind of understanding of art history. It, in fact, is the very art history that many of us were brought up on, but a troubling art history because it left so much out of that conversation.
Absolutely. And I think that the first time, I'm so sorry. This is the kind of private conversational mode that I'm so used to. The first time when there was, you remind me of the date when you
2004.
2004. And when the Cézanne was not the entry point, but was placed later, I think Jed Pearl, was it, who wrote a piece, as I recall, complaining hugely that if you didn't have this iconic work in the entrance, how were you to orient yourself, and that the whole learning experience had been lost. But the beauty of doing that is, in fact, not to march en filade. And what happens then? You discover an iconic work afterwards, retrospectively, retroactively. And then when you do that, it changes the history of your viewing and the history of art itself. So in a way, these great works of art, which we're familiar with, have to continually be rediscovered. And one way of rediscovering them is to place them in other contexts. And then you see a different non-linear form of influence, of contribution, of design, of material emerging. And I think that's why this is a very important topic that you've just raised.
So it's so interesting to me that you can have a critical public that demands change, but as soon as you deliver on that promise, there is a great deal of anxiety that somehow those mileposts, those familiar icons that you need to understand your universe are no longer fixed. And as will become clear over the course of this conversation, I spent 30 years trying to destabilize the institution. My solution to remaining in the present wasn't to deaccession everything, because that was no longer, if it ever was, practical, but was to destabilize any given history in order to recognize that history itself, the way we understand a moment, is constantly being shaped, reshaped, and reformed. But let's look at another way of conceptualizing the museum might be to think of it as rhizomic, right? That there are certain branches, certain roots, and those roots give rise to different histories and trajectories. And I like juxtaposing this rhizomic image, and my wife will immediately say, you know nothing about botany and gardens. You shouldn't traffic in arenas that you're unfamiliar with. But I understand this diagram to mean that you can have a history that is made up of many different histories, yet all linked. And I wonder, Homi, whether that is a different way of understanding the possibility of a museum.
Surely. It's a much more networked idea. And the beauty of networks is that, again, because they don't tell you what's the beginning and what's the end, what's the cause and what's the consequence, these are matters that you discover. So there is a way in which the audience's agency is absolutely engaged in the work of the museum. I think it's a very important thing. I just want to say, when you said, you change things because you want to in some way be more challenging, you want to break the kind of visual habit, you want to bring in conundrum and questioning rather than assertion, I think audiences find that tough because critics don't take it up. And here, this is the way in which the written word, the lecture, actually influences the way in which people are made to think about art or about literature or about architecture. And therefore I think that just as we look at the structure of institutions like museums, universities, etc., we should also think of the critique. What is critique? These days, this word, which has a great history from Kant all the way to our own time, people say, oh, don't think about critique, just think about enjoying the beauty of it. Enjoying the beauty of things is never outside a construction. That's why I think reviewing, writing, talking is so important, because this is a way of making the museum conceptually, as we're doing. And it's almost as important as how you assess your experience as you walk through it. So I think it's a collaboration of the arts and the critical arts that is so important in the rhizometric museum, where the networking is much more intricate. There is a freedom to it, but it is not anarchy.
So I think that's a critical point, which is, and you started off when you were talking about this rhizomic diagram by invoking the public. What this idea of the museum does is it gives agency to visitors to choose how they want to navigate the museum, what they want to take out of it as much as what they want to contribute to it. And I actually felt that when we were, and you were complicit in this because Homi was very much one of the key advisors to the museum as we were beginning to really grapple with how to reimagine the museum in anticipation of 2019 when we opened a new building, and we'll get to that. I always felt that our public was far more critically adept than we gave them credit for.
Absolutely.
And that you have to trust the art, but you also have to trust the public, that the public people will look, they will think, and if you create an environment, a context that invites them to query, that says it's okay to look at something and not to know the answer, that you will get surprising results. And I remember one of the key things that another advisor and friend of Homi's said to us in 2019 was, if you want people to do that, to have that critical inquiry, why do you always put your benches in the middle of the gallery? Well, we put them in the middle of the gallery so people can circulate around them. We don't want to interrupt the flow. And she said, well, that's a really dumb idea because you're not directing people to look at anything. Why don't you put your benches in front of key works of art that you hope people will think about? So there was an enormous amount of resistance to that. One, what would it do? It wouldn't let other people look at the object at the same time, and all people were going to do is use their cell phones in front of a painting instead of in front of the middle, in the middle of the room. Well, we did it, and what did we discover? That people did not look at their cell phones; they looked at the painting, and even more interestingly, they started talking to each other, strangers talking to each other about the works of art they were looking at. So one small gesture changed the way people experienced the galleries and opened up the kind of possibilities that a rhizomic approach might take. So, and here is an installation from 2019 by Amy Stillman, a contemporary artist who was invited to sort of dig through the institution and present an installation. And she called this The Shape of Shape. And I think of this actually as a very rhizomic installation, that she is allowing all these connections to sprout up and take shape in ways that would be very difficult for most curators to assemble. That, and I know, Homi, you think of this very much as a domestic environment.
Yes, I did. Because if you think about it, most of the things we collect, or at least I'm able to collect, I don't curate them, but I place them in ways that are in the domestic space, but in ways that somehow I feel that there is an echoic quality, that there is an echoing. And in fact, rhizometric museums also don't want to formalize necessarily how you look at things. So I would say that most of the things we collect, whether it's postcards or pottery or whatever, have a kind of a rhizometric place in our homes. We walk from one room to another. There is an echo here, a whisper there that we encounter. I did think that this was, when you talked about the rhizometric, I thought this is very much the way in which the freedom, if you don't have great collections and you don't think of yourself as a great collector, but you think of yourself as a weekend collector, then that's the way we think about things. That's the way we place things around us. And I remember seeing this and felt that it did that job very well. It actually broke many of the curatorial rules and norms. And when you look at it, in the shape, I mean, I don't know many of these works, but and it's better not to author them, because then you begin to see the way in which on the left, maybe it's the right here, you have that kind of circularity, you have that nucleus there. In India we would call it a bindu. You have it, and then you move across it. The next one is much more linear, and then you move across it, and then it explodes, and then you come back to it in the red work, and then you move to the blue work, and that walled kind of object, that walled pattern there, the shape of shape, is now a kind of omphalos. It's now a kind of central, almost naval space. So I loved this. I loved what you did with this.
This is why I love talking to Homi. And by the way, he's not a weekend collector, because there are so many beautiful objects in his home that I covet, that it's far more than that. But what I think is so important about this installation is it is not an installation with all of the great works of art from the Museum of Modern Art's collection. In fact, some of you may recognize one or two, but by and large, these are works that were in our reserves that hadn't been displayed for decades, if at all. But what Amy shows us, and I think this is, from a curatorial perspective, is an extraordinarily important lesson, is you can make almost any work of art interesting if you give it a context that's interesting, if you create loops and relationships and linkages that allow you to see something that you wouldn't have seen before. And that's, I think, the beauty of the rhizomic model, is that if you have the confidence to break with the rules that we were brought up with as curators of works of art more or less statically placed on a wall, you can start to create environments that are transfixing.
Let me just say, you're so right there, Glenn. The most boring show that I went to, Jackie and I rushed to Washington, D.C. in the National Gallery. I think, if I'm not wrong, it was on the Dutch Masters. And you had one after another, after another, after another. Their unique contributions were dulled. And I was asleep, more or less, walking in my sleep through it. So to wake it up, and I think it's about waking up things. You wake up the reputation of a work, just like you wake up in the morning and the dream is more weird than it ever was when you were experiencing it, and there is another moment to deal with. I think what MoMA has done is what I would call waking up, and really having woken up traditions and works that we're familiar with.
I love this idea of waking up. I mean, I think if there's one thing that makes me excited when I go to a museum I don't know, is when objects and installations wake me up, spark my interest, don't do what I expect them to do. And I think familiarity, while comforting, is actually very problematic within the kind of pedagogy of the museum. That our role, whether it's a historic institution or a contemporary institution or a museum of Islamic art, is to, in a way, disrupt your expectations so that you see something you didn't know was there previously.
Yeah, we're talking about waking up. In Walter Benjamin's The Arcades Project, which is architectural, aesthetic, philosophical, the notion of waking is extremely important. And the way in which waking is a moment of transition and displacement, although we hopefully wake up every morning. If we don't, then there's another problem. But
it's a different kind of displacement.
That's a different kind of displacement. Yes, exactly. So I love this. One thing I wanted to ask you, you talked about the museum and the public, and when you talk about the museum, you were talking about curators, really. So I want to know how you think about curatorial invention. Are curators somewhere between the public and the iconicity of that particular museum and its history? How much does a curator, how free are they to read what they want? How do they maintain a certain pedagogy of non-partial, but critical perspective? I'm very interested to know, because increasingly we're told curators have interfered between the history of the institution and the public, and they do whatever they like. And I just think that curators need a better read than that.
Well, I have a higher degree of respect for curators than that. I do think curators are translators. They have to navigate between their knowledge of artist or a moment or an idea, the objects themselves, which are the ones that are available to them to tell that story in that moment, which may not be the ones they wanted, but they happen to be the ones that are available. So they're translating between their knowledge and the available objects, and then the space of the museum and the public. And I actually think that curators are not neutral.
No.
I don't, and nor are they objective. They may be thoughtful and scholarly. I hope they are. But they're there to tell their story, to interpret for us how they want to see something. And I want that person's voice. I used to, when I was at the Art Gallery of Ontario, I used to get into fierce arguments with Matthew Teitelbaum, who was the chief curator and a very good friend of Homi and mine. And I would say that the museum's voice has to be neutral. We have to be objective. And Matthew would say, you're out of your mind. Everybody has a voice, and we have to let that voice come through. And, you know, here I am 30 plus years later, and he was right. It pains me to say that. But he was right, that actually when I go to an exhibition, I want that critical take. And I'm okay with the fact that I might disagree with it, but I want to know where the person is coming from and what they are seeing and what they want me to see. And then I'll be the judge of whether or not it inspires me. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. But I was, a curator asked to speak to me just last week to say that in a particular exhibit of politically and socially sensitive issues, there was a sense that the curator had not been, neutrality is not, it had not been impartial. Let's use instead of neutrality something that's more charged but impartial. And that that the curator had imposed a view. So is it different to create a voice than impose a view? Is there a distinction between those two things?
Well, so this cuts to the heart of some of the current political issues that are cleaving institutions, where boards of trustees rightly want to protect the institution from whatever complex problems might arise from the institution being seen to be impartial. And I remember many conversations with trustees at MoMA about the need for the museum to be neutral. And there is no such thing as a neutral museum. We make choices every day about what to display and how to display it. And I don't think there's such a thing as an impartial museum. What I think is important is to recognize your biases, to recognize the point you're coming from, and to offer competing perspectives. In other words, if you're going to take a strong position on an issue, be brave enough to also recognize that there are other perspectives and find a way to, at the very least, accommodate them, even if at the end of the day they aren't the ones you're going to pursue it. You know, in the United States, with the post-George Floyd reckoning around race, and then after October 7th and the horrors of Hamas's attack on Israel, any question around Palestinian rights became immediately toxic. But you can't talk about the horrors that took place in Israel without also talking about the realities of a displaced Palestinian people. So how do you do that in a way that's honest and respectful? Let's keep going, because we could stay on that all evening.
Happily, we're in Canada, so we don't need to stay on that all evening.
So I want to propose one other way of thinking, or actually two other ways of thinking about the museum. We have the torpedo, we have the rhizomic model, and here is a painting by Jack Whitten called A Topolis for Edouard Glissant. Edouard Glissant being the great Caribbean poet and philosopher that was also a friend of Jack's. And this magisterial painting, it's almost 15 feet long by close to 10 feet tall, for me, evokes or allows me to think about the idea of islands in the sea, this notion of the ways in which an archipelago is shaped and formed, and the idea of the museum made up of a series of discrete spaces linked to each other through the overall experience of the museum, but independent of each other, strikes me as another way of theorizing the institution.
Yeah, and the beauty of this painting and of your way of thinking of what I think with Glisson you called archipelagos, the archipelagic effect, is that what it shows you is that the density of the work around these dark spaces to which you directed me, it shows you in a way that these dark spaces are covered, but they're always present. You know, they maybe you can cover them in all kinds of ways, emblematically, figuratively, but it does show you something about emptiness upon which all representation is founded.
And upon which experience is created.
Which
out of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when you have these islands, there's also a very interesting play here beyond the work itself. But since you use the word islands, I'm going with that. Between the territoriality of space. I mean, you know, if you look at that, not in here, no, even if you look at that, if you look out of a plane, very often at night, you will see something similar to this. You know, cities lit up and then dark spots. And I think what is so brilliant is the management of the emptiness. And that's where the islands are not only dense, but at their literality, at the coast, something else happens in between land and sea. The land on which our feet are firm, the sea on which they are less so. And I think so much of the challenge of the museum is to land you in a place and keep the water open, to give you a sense of stability, and yet to say it's not stability and instability, but it's the transition from the one state to another, as we see in this great painting. It's a brilliant thing to bring up in terms of the structure of the museum.
And Jack called it atopolis, by which he meant no place, right? He's creating a neologism of two Greek words. And by no place, he would also mean any place, right? That in this space is a space that can be any space. And I think when you translate that to a museum, it gives you an enormous amount of opportunity to imagine different configurations. And I was struck recently at the new LACMA. This is the David Geffen wing at LACMA, this giant, almost biomorphic form that crosses over Wilshire Boulevard, the Sherbrooke Street of Los Angeles. But if you look at the way the actual galleries are disposed, really, they are just a series of cells located in this large sea, and the invitation is to navigate through the sea on your boat, as it were, and land in any one of these cells that may or may not be directly related to a cell adjacent to it. And I think, and I know this from Michael Govan, who was the brilliant director who oversaw this project, that Glisson was very much in his mind. The idea that you could create a new model for a museum, one that was not vectored the way the torpedo through time was vectored, nor was it rhizomic by implying an underlying set of roots, but that actually had an open flow to it. And just for those of you who haven't been there, this is what it looks like with these boxes or cells scattered in a rather random configuration, but where the real action isn't in the boxes, it's in the flow of space around them. And I just thought, I love the way you can translate a theory or an idea into physical space.
So if we could go back to the previous slide, there are two things. I think, that I just want to add and see where we can go with this. One, we've been talking with the metaphors of the sea. We've been talking with metaphors of the islands. And you have put on the table the idea of destabilization. You said you wanted to destabilize the habits of viewing and the habits of mind, if I might add. But one of the most interesting things about the gap spaces, which is like in the Witten, these gaps, these empty spaces, this is where time lurks too. Not the dated time of any particular work, but the time of how you maneuver phenomenologically, as a person, as an existential experience, the relationship between body, space, time, and vision. It's almost like moving from one memory to another, or one impact to another. So in those spaces that we've been talking about as archipelagic spaces, or we've been talking about as, sea islands, there is also this sense of maneuvering time and how you walk through it, rather than the linearity of the bar. But this reminds me of something, particularly when you associate it with destabilization. And it comes from a thought from Conrad's Lord Jim. Because, in my spare time, I teach a little literature. I want my credentials to be, front and center. And Jim, and Conrad writes, he's trying to think about a figure like Lord Jim who's completely destabilized. He exists between shame and guilt for various things. He travels the world frenetically. There's a conversation where somebody is talking to somebody else and says, so what is this about this destabilized life? And he says, the more kind of guru-like figure says, immerse yourself in the destructive element and then kick and kick and kick to keep yourself afloat. And it just seems to me that there is something that we are getting at there. It's both philosophical, that there is this gap in time and gap in space which we try and fill up. In the museum space, we try and restructure it. But it's also about the canvas, the Witten canvas, There are these moments that are recessive, withdrawn, blank. And that is so important. The blankness of space in any representation is what allows the more figurative or the more concrete material to stand out.
I think you can even push that to the idea of resistance.
Absolutely, you could.
You need to push against something, both emotionally and intellectually, but physically as well. That as you move through the space of the museum, which is a temporal process, you're also resisting the flow of the institution because you have to make discrete decisions about where to go and what to see. Let me see if I can bring up this is just to suggest that in a place like the Museum of Modern Art, where you can't start de novo, what we were lucky enough to do was to do a great deal of rebuilding and reorganizing to try and create, out of those vectored spaces I first showed you, a series of spaces that allowed for a more fluid or archipelagic experience. I'm going to move quickly because I'm conscious of time. I want to leave you on the subject of theorizing museums with André Malraux and the Musée Imaginaire, that has been the subject of a great deal of my thinking for the last several years, because André Malraux, in 1947, developed the idea of an imaginary museum, the Musée Imaginaire, which was translated into English as a museum without walls, which loses in that translation the essence of the idea, that it is in your mind that you create the ideas that give structure to your museum. And his idea was, simply put, that no museum could ever be complete. No museum could ever have all the objects in it you would want it to have. So the only way you could assemble that museum was as an act of the imagination, an act of the mind. And so he produced several publications. You see here a photograph from an article about him in 1954, where he's laying out his Musée Imaginaire, which was going to be revealed as a publication. And he went on to become a celebrated minister of culture, the first minister of culture in France, and a very controversial figure at the end because he was a myth maker. He certainly knew how to mythologize himself, but more importantly, he moved from being center-left to pretty much hard-right or center-right. And so politically, he became a complicated figure. But if we concentrate on what this photograph shows us, it shows us a man creating his own museum. So the impartiality that you talked about is completely foregone here. This is the museum that he imagines. And when he writes about the Musée Imaginaire, he says, and of course, anyone else would have a different Musée Imaginaire. So he gives us license to create our own imaginary museum. And why I am so struck by this image, which I could spend hours deconstructing for you, and then you'll miss the hockey game, and then you'll be mad at me, is that for me, at the end of the day, museums are about ideas. They are first and foremost places of thought. We go there to look at art. We go there to be with other people looking at art. But we really go there to think and to be engaged with the thoughts of the institution. So let me... this is a friend of Homi and mine, Dayanita Singh, who creates her own museums. And she does so in a way that makes me think of the Musée Imaginaire, that here's an artist who uses her own archive to create museums. And here is her Museum of Chance at the Museum of Modern Art now. And what I love about this is it's both an archive, but it's not passive. And maybe, Homi, you want to talk about the way in which she activates this idea.
Yes, thank you, Glenn. I think this follows so beautifully, and thank you for constructing this really both gorgeous and deeply intuitive set of images to work with. So one of the important things is that she, Dayanita, has created these framing boxes, or these framing screens, really, framing screens, because she not only feels that they're more ambulatory, they can be picked up, they can be put in different places. She also has small versions of them, like suitcases with her various images. So they're more ambulatory. They are not, sometimes they're on the wall, but often they're not in the wall, or if the authority of having something in the wall is often broken by having a manufactured artifice, which is not on the wall where you often expect to see things if they're not sculptural. But what's even more important, I think, about the Museum of Risk is that any of these plates that you see, and she does this increasingly, can be removed and other photographs can be placed in them. So in a way, it's like a living, breathing, active montage. And of course, by doing that montage-like movement, that maneuver, you have to reinvent the narrative of this archive. You cannot just say, this is the work of Dayanita Singh, 1975 to 1995. You cannot even say, oh, this is part of her work on architectural buildings in India. You have to each time juggle chance. You have to juggle with her career. You've got to juggle with the visuality and make your own work. And that's how she gives agency to the work and the viewer and allows herself a certain kind of freedom. But when I did the most recent talk I did with her, one of the things I suggested was something close to the to the island metaphor, the archipelago metaphor, in the Witten, with the dark, empty spaces. And you know, dark, empty spaces are threatening spaces, because they're also spaces of where there is not no meaning, but there is meaning. They are less than meaning and more than meaning, because you can project on them. And one of the things that I suggested to her was that all these ambulatory movements, museums work, not only because you can take one image and supplant it with another, but that as you remove one image, you create that Witten-like gap. So the movement of this kind of work, which is not hung on a wall, is that it always reveals, in a way, the pre-photographic. It always reveals the pre-representational movement without which representation wouldn't happen. The blank screen, and then the camera and the light falls on it, and suddenly that blankness is turned into, you know, Sacré-Cœur and people dancing in the streets of Paris. So I think the real conceptual thrill of the work is the revelation of the absence, which allows the image to be reshifted and removed. Do you see what I'm saying? That the narrative changes because there is no fixed form to it. And what changes the narrative are exactly those dark moments in Witten against which he places his islands of seeing and his islands of meaning.
So let's look at one last sequence before turning this over to you. I'm going to move past this. Here we go. This is for Lillian. One of the great moments in the reinstallation at the Museum of Modern Art, when we asked ourselves, how do we disrupt our histories? How do we keep the past present? How do we make the Demoiselles d'Avignon a work of contemporary art, not a work that's from 1907? And as we thought about it, we came to the idea that, first of all, we could bring Faith Ringgold's Die number 5, a painting from the 1960s by an African-American woman, into conversation with Picasso. The very act of doing that immediately split our audience into those who found it liberatory and exciting, and that it made Picasso young again, to those that were deeply offended that we could introduce into the sacred space of early Cubism the work of an African-American woman. But the whole gambit was to destabilize our reading of Picasso, not only by introducing Faith Ringgold, but also the work of other artists like Louise Bourgeois into this conversation. If Picasso's painting was in fact a painting about women, nude women, women in a brothel, well, where was the voice of women? Where was their presence in this conversation? So we brought Ringgold into the conversation. We brought Louise Bourgeois and other women artists. And what people who were deeply upset by this juxtaposition failed to understand is that for many years, Faith Ringgold came to the Museum of Modern Art every day. And what did she come to the Museum of Modern Art every day to see? Guernica. And the moment you understand that Guernica is in her mind, not just the violence of Guernica relating to the street violence that she saw during the riots in the 60s, but the scale of the painting, the ambition of the painting, the contours of the painting, you begin to understand that there is a conversation across time that valorizes both the Ringgold and the Picasso. And my last observation about this is that when I was trying to explain how I wanted to think about these to the artist Walid Rad, who did many of my PowerPoint images for me, I wanted to constantly evoke the notion of memory, that we look at something and we remember something else. And so the ghosting that you see here, the way in which these images layer one on top of the other, was his way of trying to visualize the way in which our own memory is constantly present when we look at a work of art.
Glenn, can you go back to the previous slide for a minute? Because I think you've done more, no, the one before that, yeah. Because I think you've done more in this, and I only see it now, to do with memory and history than the Faith Ringgold, Picasso duality or triangularity. Because am I not right, and I may be completely wrong, I'm not an art historian, that Demoiselle d'Avignon had a whole history of contestation because people said these are Algerian or African style women being put in this painting. So I think in that first primitivism show, there'd been a whole, a real ruckus about this painting. So now you bring that primitivistic memory, the screen memory, as Freud might call it. So there is that behind the Demoiselle, that whole controversy, intellectual, visual, physical, historical, feminist. There's that, and there's the Faith Ringgold. So when you talk about ghosting, there are three works there. What is being ghosted is what is ghosting, what is haunting, spectral is a particular reading of that earlier work as it ignited a whole controversy. So you bring that back to us. So there is always a third perspective or a third space in these forms of juxtaposition.
And with that, let's turn it over to all of you for your questions. It's hard for me to see because the lights are quite bright, but if you have a question, raise your, we'll start right there. And there's a microphone coming down to you. It will miraculously appear.
The oldest university art gallery in Canada is in Sackville, New Brunswick, late 19th century. A very handsome, it's a sandstone building. And all around it, the founders of the museum carved in stone the names of their pantheon of the time. The canon, if you will. There was Titian, Leonardo, and then Landseer and Reynolds, because English art was very, very present in Canada at the time. And then you got a little bit more contemporary, and you had Corot, and you had Bonheur, who in those days did not need the name Rosa in front because her competence was recognized. And then finally, they had an artist, G.F. Watts. And I confess I had never heard of G.F. Watts. And when I looked...
You may not be alone in this room.
Okay, exactly. G.F. Watts was huge in the 19th century. He was the English Michelangelo. He made huge paintings and huge sculptures. And he was married to the actress Ellen Terry. And he's disappeared. So you can see where my question is going, that everything is transient. Do you think about how within the collection of the museum, obviously you must have seen it, the power of fashion and the transience of very much art?
No, I think, of course, and I'm sure Homi has a perspective on this as well, that when you deal with the present, you do not deal with the certainty of time, of the distance that time and history provide. So it's why Barr imagined the museum jettisoning large parts of its collection every 50 years, because he believed you wanted to take a lot of risks, you wanted to believe in artists, and over time you form judgments about which artists endure the longest. But it's why being an artist is so difficult. It takes enormous courage and risk to make something, to put it out there, and to hope that people will understand it and appreciate it over time. The reality is a fraction of the artists who practice on any given day will make work that will endure for long periods of time. But what we can do is to be far more open-minded about the different practices that occur at any one time, and to look perhaps with a greater field of vision. Faith Ringgold was around in 1967. The Museum of Modern Art could have acquired that painting then, but we didn't see her. We literally, she wasn't in our field of vision. And it took a great deal of events before we understood how important she was. In the same way, there are a lot of artists in our collection that we thought were, critical to any understanding of modern art that today we don't display, and you won't remember their name, and neither will I. Let's take another question. Yes, down here. Well, you go, and then we'll come to here.
Hi. Actually, I came because I really like art.
Could you speak louder?
Yes,
it's just hard to hear.
I really like art, and this discussion is really interesting as someone who's not artsy.
Can't hear you, ma'am.
And my question is more about the youth, because sometimes in the museums, you talked about blankness of space, chaos, restructuring chaos, and it reminds me of a childlike, creativity, and because I have cousins and I want them to get more interest in arts in museums. And my question is, when it comes to modern art, sometimes those children, they're not in the equation. And I would like to know, how can we, so in a world where digital experience dominate their intention, how do we help them, the youth, develop real agency, and how they encounter, how they see the art? How can I bring them, to explore that? Because when we talk about museum, it's more like here in Montreal we have Musée des Beaux-Arts, very traditional, but contemporary art, it's very hard to swallow, especially as a kid. You don't really understand. So how can we give them that type of guidance?
I think I understood your question to be that you have young cousins that you would love to be able to get interested and excited about visiting museums, maybe even museums of modern art. So I have a son who's now reporting live for the CBC from Jerusalem, who I tried to take to the museum on a regular basis because I thought it would be interesting and nice for me to spend some time with him, and who is so allergic to the space of the museum that his response when I brought him to the Museum of Modern Art for the first time, and after about 15 minutes, he turned to me and said, "Dad, can we go now?" Which was almost as embarrassing as when we were at the opera and he said the same thing at the beginning of the second act. So, not everybody's going to like museums. Not everybody will find sustenance and encouragement and enjoyment out of them. And so on one level, I think the most you can do is engage people with the ideas, but be respectful of the fact that everybody goes at a different pace, that it's okay not to be interested in this work of art, but that work of art. And it's also okay to just go to a museum and look at one object and leave.
So my feeling here is that the digital medium is itself a very interesting representational medium. I'm saying as a medium. There may be works that are good, there may be works that are bad, but as a medium, it's very important. And there is nothing you can do to distance somebody from the media of the moment. It's a very difficult thing to do. But I think you've got to prepare yourself for a museum. And one of the ways I would suggest is, one of the differences is stillness. Standing still. A still image. Do you see what I'm saying? So different from what you see digitally. So I think cultivating the patience that is associated with pleasure has to be a precursor to the problem of how you get somebody off the screen and looking at the canvas. And I think that's the real challenge. And how one does that is an open question. But that's really the challenge. There is such a sense that anything that is now still, historically still, is obsolescent. Because with video games, things are changing all the time, with visual graphic representation. But I've decided, rather like Conrad, to immerse myself in the destructive element of the digital, to try and understand what it delivers and why this accelerated speed of visual experience is inclusive, and why the echoes and ghosts of other people are having that same experience. What were we talking about when you do something? What is it?
Endorphin.
Endorphin rush. Yeah, I think you've got to understand that notion of an endorphin rush of a very different kind. But we cannot keep, in a way, just seeing the digital as a distraction from culture. We have to try and understand how we can rethink the cultural moment.
Mary Daly had a question. We'll go here, and then we'll go over there. You're next.
Thank you.
We're going to work our way across the room.
Oh, okay. Wait. Okay. We're talking about a museum in the time of crisis, so I'm going to be the torpedo. So artificial intelligence is mediating the way we understand the world today. So I just wanted a reaction from both of you, because what I held was the curator has a voice. And in this time of crisis, it seems to me that the museum has a role to be the semantic translator of meaning. Because in artificial intelligence, technology, we cannot be naive to it. It is semantically mediating our understanding of ourselves and our world without us even knowing it. So I think the museum has a very important role to actually address this issue and maybe return semantic understanding in a human form. I would love your reaction on that.
I was just writing something like this, and I don't think my answer will please you at all. But I did think about this just before taking the plane from Boston. And here was what I wrote, and you might think it's complete bullshit, but I just want to give you the idea.
That's a scientific term.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that if you see the way in which these LLMs, large language models work, they are dialogic in the old Socratic sense. In fact, I lost a lot of hair for all kinds of reasons, but sometimes if you work with these models and you keep on prompting them to come up, so it's a very dialogic experience. Of course, what they have is, again, very similar to that question. They have infinite archival speed. They will bring you things certainly of a competence. I would not say of brilliance, but they bring you things of competence very quickly.
Can I just add one thing to that? Microphone, please, so we can hear you.
Between the dialogic LLM and the data, and the infinite access to data, is someone is designing a Rosetta Stone.
Sure.
And whoever designs that Rosetta Stone for how machines understands really has impact on global systems. And the museum is designing a Rosetta Stone for our understanding of the world. I think it's hugely important what both of you do.
Oh, thank you very much. You let us off the answer.
I would just add that, of course, artificial intelligence can be seen as a threat, but it is also a tool. And as a tool, it's very useful within the space of the museum. Because at the end of the day, we go to museums to look at objects that exist in real space, in real time. Even if they're digital objects, we come to the museum because there's a certain recognition of the, and I'm doing this in quotation marks, of the authenticity of what we are seeing. It is mediated only by our own eyes in the context the museum has provided. And I don't find artificial intelligence to threaten that experience. I actually think it can enhance it because of that infinite archival capacity where all of these associations that you might not be aware of are actually accessible to you. If you're not afraid of using artificial intelligence constructively, and the critical component of artificial intelligence isn't intelligence, it's artificial. Right?
So can I just say, just add just one thing here? It seems to me that these machines, what's important to remember that they only have half a mind of their own. The other contribution is how you mold them. So they only have half. So I refer to them as a wonderful handyman who has only half a mind of his or her own. And that's the thing I think to remember. Again, I think not to be overwhelmed by the speed of calculation and the dearth of data. Those are the real issues to deal with. And then, you know, this can be a frenemy, sometimes a friend, sometimes an enemy. But that happens all the time. I just think we need to take the pressure down a little bit and not to keep saying, you know, human agency is being disrespected or being disavowed. I think we also need a mental revolution. We need hospitality of a certain kind for something that is for the stranger in our midst.
Patiently, we'll give you the last question.
Huge thanks to both of you for this very thoughtful and inspiring talk. I would love to hear from both of you a little bit more about what might be the friction between historical specificity and the beautiful fluidity of the rhizomatic model. I'm thinking specifically about the LACMA, where I have not yet been, so it's only come from things I've read and seen. But there is such an openness and fluidity and kind of, again, beauty in seeing the interconnectedness of things across time and space. On the other hand, it's easy for people who have art historical knowledge or are thinking about culture to see the excitement in the comparison between the Faith Ringgold and the Demoiselles d'Avignon, for example. A lot harder for someone who's coming for the very first time. And to go back to the metaphors that you've been using earlier, if you are cast out into the sea with no lifeboat, you risk drowning. And so how do you provide those clear points of anchorage in history for those who might not be coming with art historical baggage, and allow for the kind of freedom of experience that a place like MoMA and LACMA offer?
So I think there are different challenges for different kinds of institutions, right? So if you are a museum like the Louvre or the Metropolitan that sets for itself, its founding idea is to tell the history of art across millennia, you're going to come up with certain propositions to do that, and certain relationships that you believe are defining it. if you're the Museum of Modern Art, where you believe your responsibility is to provide different perspectives on contemporary art practices in the present, recognizing that those perspectives are going to change all the time, and therefore your goal is not to be the torpedo in time, not to what one curator at the museum called beads on a chain, but actually you want to make it very clear that at any given moment there are competing and different possibilities that exist simultaneously. And we're not in a position to necessarily know which, over the longue durée, are going to be the most important. And it's true that for some it might be uncomfortable or destabilizing, but I actually have an enormous amount of trust in our public that people come to museums, I think, first and foremost because they're curious. They're not necessarily going to hear or to see the history of art as handed down from Moses on, 10 tablets, right? They're actually going to see something that will spark their imagination, that might bring them pleasure, that might help them understand the world better, but actually they're very open to the different possibilities that exist. And I think, to LACMA's credit, it responded to a couple of realities. The first is it doesn't have the kind of collection in which you could tell that narrative in a meaningful way. So it had to come up with a different narrative. And that narrative has to do with the sheer pleasure of looking at beautiful things in relationship to each other. And I remember when we were there at the opening, we were standing next to a dealer and his husband, and there were 4 sculptural heads on a pedestal. And they said, well, French, 18th century, 19th century, British, what are they doing together? They didn't make historical sense, but they made visual sense. They talked to each other. And I think people have the capacity to see visual linkages. And therefore, I think as a museum, we have a lot of latitude in the stories we choose to tell and how we tell them, provided we tell them thoughtfully and skillfully. So, long answer to an extraordinarily good question. Homi, last word to Homi.
So, Glenn gave you the serious grown-up answer. I'm going to give you the slightly naive answer, which is, why do we have such a faith in a particular historical order that inevitably goes from early to late? Why do we think that that is the best way of explaining, that linear way, that continuous way? Why is it not tied to a particular notion of progress from the primitive, not from the primitivism, but primitive to the more sophisticated? I don't think many people who have not been disciplined in that way traditionally through a study of a particular kind of art history need to have that kind of explanation, because it's evolutionary in a way, and there are many ways of thinking about the strengths, but also the weaknesses of evolutionary thinking. So sometimes it seems to me that the best way to look before and after historically is to begin in the middle, to begin with a shot of looking at Picasso and Ringgold. And that may be a more fractal way of thinking about museums and curation, but also about history. There were critical moments when certain things changed. Those moments, those critical moments are, you have to argue for them, but they're not foundational in the sense in which a longue durée history, which has its many uses in the annales historians or whatever, but that's not the only way, because very often that way of thinking has its own preconceptions. colonial art, or the arts of Africa, the arts of Asia, non-traditional forms of art that were cited, masks and ritual traditions are displaced and cited in Picasso, right? Now there may be a way of thinking about those more traditional, some would say tribal, ritualistic modalities post Picasso, then in thinking of them as some notion of the primitive element that then through the Renaissance became more sophisticated, the growth of perspective, the growth of 19th century history painting and so on. So I think, particularly for public knowledge, well staged, the poetics and indeed the politics of shock, of taking something at a critical moment, using that as a pivot, might be as exciting and as question probing as an already given continuous sense. Maybe that already given continuous sense tells you about succession, but maybe it doesn't tell you about the struggle for survival within artists and traditions that don't have that linear, peaceable issue. That's a construction. And our pedagogy has made that construction more interesting, or more useful. I think beginning in the middle, like in most conversations, whether you're conversing with a work of art, you're conversing with a friend, you begin with certain propositions. You begin with a point of view. The real sustenance is when in the middle of the argument you have to keep negotiating differences, disparities, how you survive the middle. I think the middle is where you really begin to know, why did I start the way I started? And you begin to question that first moment of understanding and interpretation. That, to me, has been part of the lesson I've learned from you this evening. Well, thank you very much.
Let me first thank Liliane for bringing us together. Stéphane, Mojan, François, merci pour nous réunir ce soir. C'était un grand plaisir. But most of all, I want to thank my dear friend Homi for being here with me.